Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into a story that doesn't just whisper from the shadows of history, it claws its way up from a dying king's bed, heavy with the smell of smoke, candle wax, and something far worse. Picture this with me. Right now you're standing in a dim corridor of an ancient palace, the kind of place where tapestries swallow sound and every footstep feels like it's being watched by the past. Behind one of the doors ahead, a powerful monarch is gasping for breath, his massive body sinking into sheets stained by decay, and the air around him is so thick with dread that even the guards refuse to look directly into the room. If you're imagining this and thinking, yeah, you probably won't survive this one, then congratulations, you're exactly in the right mood for tonight's descent. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me below where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love knowing how far across time zones these late-night journeys travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The door opens slowly, not because anyone is trying to be gentle, but because the hinges don't quite know how to hold the weight of what's happening inside. This is Whitehall Palace in the winter of the year 1547, and the most feared king in Europe is lying in a bed that has become more like a dying cathedral, a place where the walls have absorbed too many secrets to stay still. Henry VIII, the monarch who once thundered across tournaments and danced through golden halls, is trapped beneath his own collapsing body, a giant sinking deeper each night into the suffocating gravity of his sins. The room is heavy with the scent of rotting flesh. Servants come and go with bowls of herbs and embers meant to mask the odor. But nothing can truly overwhelm the stench of a body that is turned against itself. The tapestries hang limp, as if recoiling from him, and the candles flicker in an unsteady rhythm, their flames trembling like witnesses caught in a confession. Every night Henry lies there, drifting in and out of pain, and each time he slips toward the edge of sleep, the shadows thicken at the edges of the room. The guards outside pretend not to hear him scream, but his voice carries down the hallway like a crack in the stone. He shouts names that no one has spoken in years: Catherine, Anne, Jane. More, and when the servants find him in the morning, his face is wet with tears, his hands clawing at the darkness as if trying to push something away. What he sees is invisible to everyone else, and yet unmistakably real to him. These are not ghosts in the supernatural sense. They are the echoing forms of the people he betrayed, abandoned, manipulated, or executed. The human mind has its own way of summoning justice, and Henry's mind has chosen to hold court in the dead of night. If you look close, you'll see the first of them standing quietly in the corner, her presence more felt than seen. Catherine of Aragon, the wife he swore to cherish, who wasted away alone after a lifetime of loyalty. She does not speak. Henry does all the speaking for her. Next to her stands Anne Boleyn, her dark eyes unwavering, her neck forever marked by the memory of a French executioner's blade. The image of her alone would be enough to unmake a lesser man, but Henry's visions bring more than one. Jane Seymour appears with the fragile glow of a candle about to go out, the wife who died giving him the heir he demanded. And Catherine Howard, barely more than a girl, hovers near the bed like a scream trapped in a human shape. Her last moments still echo through Hampton Court corridors, and Henry hears them every time he closes his eyes. These phantoms, born from guilt and memory, haunt him not with violence, but with presence. They stand there through the night, silent judges delivering a verdict he can no longer ignore. Henry gropes at the air, begging forgiveness, insisting he had no choice, blaming his advisors, blaming God, blaming fate, but never himself, not fully, not even now. His once mighty voice cracks under the weight of his own history, and the walls of Whitehall absorb his pleas the way stone absorbs cold deeply, permanently, without mercy. It's strange to think that this same man once strode through Europe like a golden lion. In the early years of his reign, around the year 1509, He was the very picture of power, tall, athletic, broad-shouldered, riding horses with the grace of a knight and dancing with the lightness of a poet. Women adored him, men admired him, and kings feared him. Yet somewhere between his desire for a male heir and the relentless tightening of his paranoia, Henry transformed into something else entirely. Every wrong he committed carved its initials into him. Every execution left a new wound. Every broken promise deepened the rot that now tears through his leg. The wound that never healed. The wound that stinks so badly servants pray before they enter his chambers. He knows he is dying. He can feel it. It's not the kind of death that sneaks in softly. It is the kind that drags itself across the floorboards, scraping closer each night, breathing hot across his throat as he whimpers for air. And yet the most terrifying visitor waiting for him at the end is not death itself. Henry has faced death on battlefields and in childbirths and in courts of law. What he fears now are the faces he will meet again when he steps out of this world. Death is the doorway. What waits behind it are the people he spent 38 years trying to bury. The court around him is already preparing for a world without him, whispering about the future of his fragile son Edward, the boy born from Jane's final breath. They say the kingdom stands on the edge of uncertainty, that the balance of power trembles like every candle in Henry's room, that the sins of the king will pass to the heirs whether they want them or not. And as the king gasps in his final nights, the ghosts only come closer. They do not touch him. They do not speak. They simply stand, patient and solemn, as if waiting for him to acknowledge something he has never admitted, that he, the greatest king England ever feared, will die hated, lonely, and judged by the very women he once believed he owned. By the time the sun rises on the 28th day of January in the year 1547, Henry's final breath rattles in his chest. Some say he reached out. Some say he saw someone. And some swear that just before the room fell silent, the shadows at the foot of his bed moved not in fear, but in recognition. The story drifts backward now, slipping away from the choking air of Henry's death chamber and sinking into a softer, earlier time when the world still looked at him with admiration instead of fear. When the scent around him was not rot, but the warm, sunlit fragrance of youth and promise. In the year 1500 Sheen, the corridors of the English court echoed with the music of a king whose footsteps were light and certain, whose laughter filled feasts like a golden invitation, whose very presence made the courtiers straighten their backs and the ambassadors rephrase their sentences. This Henry, still untouched by paranoia, still unscarred by betrayal and loss, was almost impossibly handsome, tall, broad, athletic, the kind of figure carved into legends long before he even earned them. People spoke of him the way poets speak of summer, as something too beautiful to last. He moved through the palace like a man convinced the world spun for his pleasure, and for a time, it genuinely seemed to. His mornings began with archery, tennis, or wrestling. His afternoons buzzed with political discourse, delivered with the confidence of someone who had never tasted failure. His evenings glowed with dances, music, poetry, and the effortless charm of a young king who believed destiny followed the path he ordered it to. When he mounted a horse, it was with the elegance of a knight from an illuminated manuscript. When he entered a chapel, the light fell on him as if heaven itself favored him. When he smiled, people remembered it for days. This was the Henry Catherine of Aragon married a man of vigor, warmth, generosity, and enormous appetite for life. Catherine loved him in a way only a woman raised in duty and devotion could love, steadily, deeply, and with patience that bent without breaking. She had crossed seas to be his queen, endured loss after loss in their desperate attempts to produce a living heir, and still she smiled at him with quiet faith, believing their love would survive any storm. And for a while, it did. Henry called her the truest heart in England, a phrase he whispered with sincerity before his throne taught him how fickle affection becomes in the hands of power. When they walked side by side, the court murmured that England had never seen a royal pair so united. But beneath that unity, A question flickered dangerously. A question Henry felt growing louder each year. The same question that would one day twist him into the dying creature, now gasping in that stinking bed. What if I never have a son? What will become of my kingdom? That fear, at first a whisper, grew claws. He watched Catherine age under the strain of childbirths that ended in heartbreak. He watched their hopes rise with every pregnancy and collapse again with every funeral. The pressure of lineage, the weight of legacy, the terror of leaving England leaderless, all of it gnawed quietly at him, turning sleepless nights into restless obsessions. Henry began studying scriptures, looking for signs, looking for proof that God might be punishing him, looking for someone to blame other than fate. The court noticed the shift before he did. The once laughing king began to brood. His smiles dimmed, his patience shortened. He rode harder, hunted longer, and drank deeper, trying to outrun a destiny he feared might be written against him. Through the halls of court, the clergy whispered about divine judgment. The nobles traded rumors like coins. Catherine prayed in dim chapels until her knees bruised, and Henry paced his chambers, staring at his reflection as if his future lay somewhere inside the tremble of candlelight across his features. A man who had once felt infinite now felt small, vulnerable, exposed. And it was in that vulnerability that cracks began to form, the kind of cracks that let danger slip inside like water seeping through a stone wall. Because courtly life is a delicate ecosystem, a place where beauty becomes power, where intelligence becomes threat, and where one pair of dark eyes watching from across a feast hall can redirect the course of history. Anne Boleyn had not yet stepped into Henry's orbit, but the wind was already shifting toward her. Every fragile moment, every lost child, every whispered prayer Catherine offered in the dark, every restless sigh Henry released into the cold night air, each one was loosening the hinge on a door neither of them could see yet. For now, though, Henry still believed himself righteous. He still woke each morning bathed in sunlight that poured through the palace windows like a blessing. He still spoke to Catherine with tenderness after their losses. He still held her hand, still called her my Kate, still believed the two of them were fighting the same battle against fate. But deep inside, the question sharpened its edge. If God wanted us to have a son, why would he deny it if not Catherine? Then who? It was a dangerous question, the kind that once asked cannot be unasked. A question that would smolder quietly beneath the surface of Henry's noble exterior until the day it exploded into flames that burned Catherine's life, Anne's life, and eventually Henry's own soul. The court did not yet see the shadow spreading behind Henry's smile. They still saw the golden prince they adored. They still saw the promise of a long and glorious reign. They still saw a king who could kneel beside his wife in prayer and rise with hope in his eyes. Only Catherine noticed the slight change in his posture when another pregnancy ended, the extra second of silence before he offered comfort, the stiffness in his embrace as if holding grief made him feel trapped. She knew something in him was shifting, sliding, slipping away like sand between fingers. And though she tried desperately to anchor him with loyalty and love, Catherine could not stop the tide gathering strength behind her husband's restlessness. Henry's footsteps, once light and joyful, began to sound different across the palace floors, slower, heavier, almost echoing with a weight he had not carried before. The servants heard it first, then the ladies in waiting, then the ambassadors, and finally Catherine herself. A king who begins to doubt destiny begins to look for signs in places signs do not exist. And a king who looks long enough eventually sees what he wants to see, even if it ruins him. Mary's story was shaped by politics. Elizabeth's was shaped by survival. But Henry's was shaped by fear, fear of legacy, fear of failure, fear that he might be the last link in a chain meant to stretch across centuries, and fear, when fed long enough, becomes hunger. Soon that hunger would find Anne Boleyn, and the Golden Prince would begin his long descent into the nightmare we met in part 1. Anne Boleyn stepped into Henry's life not like a storm, but like a change in the air. subtle enough to go unnoticed at first glance, yet powerful enough to set everything around her into motion. When she returned from France carrying the sharp confidence and cultured elegance of the European courts, along with those dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold their own secrets, the English court felt an immediate shift. Anne was not the kind of woman men fell for instantly, but she was the kind they lost sleep over. She carried the scent of unfamiliar lands, the calm of a woman who knew her worth, and the quiet danger of someone who understood that power often came wrapped in silk rather than steel. Catherine saw this long before Henry did, not because Anne tried to tempt the king, but because her very presence answered the question Henry had been asking himself for years, if not a son with Catherine. Then with whom Henry first noticed Anne at a small gathering, the kind of feast where music trembled softly through the hall and candlelight painted warm halos across the faces of the courtiers. When Anne laughed, it was not the polite laughter of a lady eager for approval, but the confident, effortless laughter of someone who had learned long ago that she never needed to plead for attention. Henry watched her from across the room, expecting her to bow her head and blush when she realized the king's gaze rested upon her. Instead, Anne looked directly back at him and held his stare, unflinching, poised, entirely unafraid. It was a subtle moment, a quiet moment, but it lodged itself in Henry's mind like a spark caught in dry tinder. From that instant, something in Henry slipped out of its old rhythm. He felt an energy around Anne he had not felt in years, an edge, a challenge, a sense that she belonged to a future he had not yet imagined, but desperately wanted to step into. Anne did not try to belong to him. Instead, she made him feel he needed to earn his way into her orbit. Every gift she refused, every polite distance she created, every measured silence she held in his presence stirred something deep and restless inside him. Henry, who had always lived in a world where women bowed and men deferred, suddenly found himself chasing, and the more Anne denied him, the more he felt destiny narrowing itself toward her name. Anne sensed the pull, though she did not chase it. What she did not realize at first was that Henry saw in her not merely a woman, but an escape, a symbol, a possibility. She represented a door out of the fear that had haunted him for years, a future where a son might finally secure the fragile Tudor line. When they spoke, their conversations moved from polite, harmless topics into more charged, dangerous territory: faith, power, reform, legacy subjects that Catherine could not explore with him because she was bound by duty, tradition, and the weight of years of shared sorrow. Anne's voice carried none of that sorrow, and Henry drank in her confidence as though it were a prophecy meant only for him. Catherine still loved Henry with the steady, unwavering devotion of a woman shaped by duty, but each time she prayed for another child, Henry felt something inside him shift further away from her. He saw her age, saw the lines between her brows deepen with every disappointment, saw the exhaustion in her steps as she carried the silent grief of failures that were never truly her fault. Meanwhile, Anne's youth, her quick wit, her poise, her unbroken spirit felt like a reminder of what Henry believed destiny still owed him. And so, love began to warp into resentment, and resentment into justification. The court murmured long before Henry did anything. Ladies whispered behind fans. Ambassadors watched with sharpened eyes, and even the servants felt the change in the air. Catherine herself saw the shadow of Anne stretch across Henry's face at every feast, every council meeting, every moment of silence. She saw him becoming a man divided, one half still tied to her through habit and memory, the other half drifting toward an unknown future with a woman who did not fear him. Anne became the subject of every rumor in England. They called her a witch, a temptress, a serpent sent to destroy a queen. But Henry listened to none of it. Every no she gave him felt like a divine instruction, a challenge sent by God, a sign that Catherine was no longer the rightful mother of the heir England needed. The truth was far simpler and far sadder. Anne was not chosen by destiny. She had simply arrived at the moment Henry's fear had ripened into obsession. Henry began to change in ways he did not notice. His laughter grew rare, his expression darker, his patience thinner. He stopped lingering in Catherine's chambers, stopped touching her hands, stopped speaking her name with warmth. He abandoned old counselors and surrounded himself with bold young scholars who fed his growing belief that God had cursed his marriage. Each night, Henry stared at the flickering candle flame as if waiting for revelation. Until one evening he whispered the words that would ignite one of the greatest transformations in European history. My marriage to Catherine was never valid in the eyes of God. It was not truth. It was desperation seeking permission. From that moment forward, the ground beneath Henry's feet shifted irreversibly. The path toward Anne was no longer an infatuation, it became a mission, a crusade, a justification for tearing England away from Rome, for uprooting centuries of tradition, for breaking Catherine's heart in ways that could never be undone. Henry, Anne, and Catherine were no longer players in a courtly love triangle. They were trapped inside the widening mouth of a storm that would swallow kingdoms, reshape religion, and lead Henry down the long, dark corridor that ended in the nightmare we saw in part 1. The Golden Prince had taken his first irreversible step toward becoming the haunted king, lying in the stench of his final winter. The moment Henry whispered that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid, something ancient and immovable inside the English crown cracked, releasing a wave of consequences no one in the kingdom, not even Henry himself, was prepared to confront. What began as a private doubt soon swelled into a fever that consumed him, pushing him toward decisions so vast and violent that they reshaped the spiritual map of an entire continent. Anne, still playing her dangerous game of distance, watched as Henry turned obsession into doctrine, and doctrine into a weapon capable of severing England's bond to Rome with one clean, merciless slice. Catherine prayed as she always had, her voice rising into the quiet corners of palaces that no longer welcomed her. While Henry stalked the corridors like a man searching for the exit to a maze only he believed existed. Every priest he questioned, every bishop he consulted, every scholar he summoned seemed to reinforce the same conclusion he already craved, that God was on his side, and the solution to the chaos inside him was not repentance, but revolution. But Rome did not bend. The Pope refused to annul the marriage that had lasted more than 2 decades, a marriage Catherine defended with the ferocity of someone who had nothing left except her dignity and her truth. She stood before church officials and swore that her union with Henry had been lawful, sacred, and consummated only with him, her voice breaking but unwavering as she pleaded not only for her crown, but for the soul of the man she still loved. Yet Henry, fueled by years of disappointment and the intoxicating promise of Anne's future, no longer saw Catherine as the woman who had once comforted him after every lost child. She had become the obstacle between him and destiny, the stone in the river that refused to be moved even as the current raged around it. Anne, watching from a shadowed distance, understood better than anyone that Henry was not merely trying to escape a marriage. He was trying to escape his own fear of failure, and fear makes men dangerous in ways ambition never could. She fed his dreams with quiet confidence, speaking of a reformist England, of a church freed from corruption, of a future where his name would be remembered not as a man who begged Rome for permission, but as a king who seized his own divine authority. Henry listened, his breath quickening with every word she offered, until the fire of his desire grew hotter than his loyalty to any earthly authority. And so he made a choice that would crack Europe in half. He defied the Pope. The year 1533 arrived like a tremor running through the soil beneath England. Henry declared himself the supreme head of the church, placing a crown of spiritual authority atop his political one. And in doing so, he tore his country out of the cradle of Catholic tradition with the kind of brutality that made bishops stammer and nobles tremble. The monasteries that had stood for centuries, sanctuaries of prayer and learning, soon found themselves stripped bare, their walls torn down, their gold melted, their relics scattered. Monks and nuns were turned out into the world like ghosts forced to walk in daylight, and although the official justification was reform, everyone knew the truth simmering beneath the surface. Henry wanted Anne, and the kingdom would bleed until he had her. Catherine was banished like an inconvenient memory, sent from palace to palace as if she were a stain the court hoped distance could erase. Her room shrank, her attendance dwindled, and her letters to Henry went unanswered until even she began to understand that she had been replaced not only in his heart, but in the narrative of England itself. Anne, meanwhile, stood on the threshold of power, her hands trembling not from fear but from the weight of inevitability. She was pregnant finally, miraculously, and the timing could not have been more perfect. Henry saw the swelling of her belly as proof that God had blessed this union, that every demolished monastery, every broken vow, every insult hurled at Rome had been righteous. He could almost feel the sun kicking inside her, a sun he believed would erase every doubt, every rumor, every sin. Their marriage, performed in secrecy and later proclaimed with thunder, shocked Europe. Henry walked through his new life with a confidence bordering on madness, convinced that he had bent destiny to his will, that no law, earthly or divine, could deny him the future he wanted. Anne, now Queen of England, moved through the court with the sharp poise of a woman who understood that every eye burned with judgment. Some admired her ability to ascend so high. Others loathed her with a venom sharpened by the loss of Catherine. But none of them could deny the sense of danger humming through the air. The knowledge that this marriage had been purchased with the most dramatic religious upheaval England had ever seen. Then came the birth. It was a cold day in September of the year 1533 when the cries of Anne's child filled the chambers. Henry, pacing with the restless energy of a man expecting triumph, turned eagerly toward the midwives as they approached. But when they bowed their heads and spoke the words no king wants to hear, Henry felt the earth tilt beneath him. The child was not a boy. It was a girl, a healthy, strong, fierce little girl, Elizabeth, but still a girl, a future queen, though no one knew that yet. Henry stared at the infant with a swirl of emotions he could not untangle: pride, disappointment, anger, defiance, fear. The court held its breath, waiting for him to erupt. But the king, exhausted by the relentless war he had waged for this moment, forced a smile and held his daughter gently, pretending not to feel the crushing disappointment settling into his bones. Anne saw it, though. She saw the flicker in Henry's eyes, the sag of his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched when he thought no one was watching. And in that flicker lay the first crack in their marriage. A crack small enough to ignore, but large enough to whisper a warning into her heart. She was queen. Yes, but queens in Henry's world lived on borrowed time, their power conditional, their survival tied to the production of a single fragile, irreplaceable thing, a son. Anne returned to her chambers and held Elizabeth close, whispering promises into the downy hair of the newborn child. Promises that history would prove astonishingly true. But Henry left the room in silence, the disappointment following him like a shadow that would grow longer and darker with each passing year. He had broken a continent to claim Anne, and now the cracks in her future were beginning to echo back toward him. Anne held Elizabeth with a tenderness that made the world outside her chambers feel distant. Yet even as she whispered to the child, she could sense the tremor in the air, a soft, almost imperceptible vibration that warned her the miracle she had given the king was not the miracle he wanted. Henry drifted through the corridors of the palace with a quiet that frightened the courtiers more than any roar he had ever unleashed. He did not scream, did not strike, did not rage. He simply withdrew gradually, like a tide rolling away from the shore and taking warmth with it. The man who had once risked kingdoms and heaven itself to marry Anne now moved through the palace with the heaviness of someone who had gambled everything and felt the prize slipping through his fingers. He told himself it was fine, that Elizabeth was strong, that there would be another child, that Anne's womb could still deliver the son destiny owed him. But every night, as he removed the rings from his swollen fingers and stared at his reflection in the polished metal mirror, he felt a sourness blooming in his chest. Europe mocked him for breaking with Rome only to welcome a daughter. Catherine's supporters whispered that God had punished him, The common folk muttered that the king had traded a faithful queen for a witch. Henry pretended not to hear, but the whispers burrowed deep beneath his skin and began to reshape him from the inside. Anne sensed the shift long before Henry realized he was changing. At feasts, when she spoke, his eyes drifted away. When she reached out to touch his arm, his body stiffened almost imperceptibly. When she laughed, the sound once so intoxicating to him now scraped against his nerves. Anne tried to remain steady, refusing to crumble under the weight of his cooling affection. Yet every gesture he withdrew from her left small cuts across her spirit. And court life, always hungry for drama, smelled blood. The same nobles who had once despised Catherine and rallied behind Anne's rise now watched her with the sharp curiosity of vultures circling a weakening creature. They saw Henry's disappointment and amplified it. They whispered that Anne was losing her charm, that she was difficult, that she was too assertive, too clever, too foreign, too ambitious. They blamed her for the religious chaos Henry himself had caused, painting her as the architect of England's suffering. Anne had not changed, only Henry's tolerance of her had. The qualities that once drew him toward her now irritated him: her sharp tongue, her political interest, her refusal to be silent, her insistence on being his equal rather than his ornament. Meanwhile, Catherine of Aragon's shadow still lay across the kingdom like a sorrowful prophecy. Her quiet dignity in exile earned her a reverence Anne could never match. And when she died in the year 1536, her death shook England more deeply than her presence had in years. It also removed a barrier Henry did not realize had once restrained him. For months he had blamed Catherine's existence for the tension in his life. Now, with Catherine gone, the pressure did not lift. Instead, it condensed around Anne, heavy and suffocating. Because she no longer had an enemy in Catherine, she had only Henry's expectations. And those expectations grew sharper with every passing week. Anne became pregnant again, and for a moment, a flicker of hope warmed the palace. Henry softened, just slightly, walking beside her with a cautious smile, touching her hand with something approaching affection. Everything in the kingdom seemed to balance on the fragile weight of the child inside her, and Anne felt herself leaning into the promise of redemption. Yet fear gnawed at her constantly. A quiet fear with claws made of memory. She knew what had happened to Catherine when her body failed the king, and she knew that Henry's love was not the kind that survived disappointment. The pregnancy ended in a stillborn child, and though Henry tried to hide his devastation, it poured through the cracks in him like water through broken stone. Some said the fetus was a boy. Others whispered that Anne had miscarried the very thing she needed most to survive. Henry stood at the foot of her bed that day with an expression that chilled her more than anger could. It was not rage. It was something colder: resignation, the look of a man already stepping away. Anne reached toward him, trembling, trying to remind him that they still had time, that they could try again, that she loved him and had risked everything for him. But Henry's eyes did not soften. Deep inside, he blamed her not for the miscarriage, but for the unraveling of the great myth he had built around their love. To admit that destiny had not chosen Anne meant admitting that he had destroyed a queen, shattered a church, and fractured a continent for nothing. So instead of confronting his own guilt, Henry let the guilt bloom in her direction, allowing Anne to become the vessel for all the disappointment he refused to carry. The court reacted swiftly, like a pack sensing weakness. Enemies Anne had made during her meteoric rise now found their voices again. The Seymours, seeing opportunity, drifted closer to the king. Jane Seymour, herself quiet, pale, poised, appeared before Henry with the softness of a woman who knew her silence was her sharpest weapon. She lowered her gaze at all the right moments, whispered with modesty, and created a contrast to Anne's assertiveness so striking that Henry felt soothed by her presence. It was not love he felt for Jane. It was escape. Anne saw the shift, saw how Henry's eyes followed Jane with the same confusion and hunger that once followed her, and terror began to settle into her bones. She tried harder, too hard, to win back Henry's affection, confronting him in moments of desperation, accusing him of betrayal, pleading with him to remember the sacrifices she had made. But Henry did not want reminders. He wanted reassurance, and Anne's fear only sharpened his resolve to pull away. Whispers spread through the palace like wind through broken shutters. They said Anne had grown unstable. They said she meddled in politics too boldly. They said she captivated the king through witchcraft. They said her miscarriage was a punishment from God, and whether he admitted it or not, Henry listened. Every rumor carved another crack into his faith in her, and every crack drew him closer to the belief that Anne had been a mistake he needed to erase. Anne stood before her mirror at night, holding Elizabeth's tiny hand, trying to steady her breath. She knew what happened to women Henry stopped loving. She knew what happened to women who disappointed him. She had watched it herself, helpless, when Catherine lost her place. Now the same storm gathered above her, darker and more violent than any she had seen before. She had risen on the wings of Henry's desire. Now she felt those wings beginning to fold, leaving her suspended in a silence that felt too much like the moment before a blade falls. The silence that surrounded Anne in the final months of her queenship was not the calm kind, not the gentle hush of a court at rest, but the tight, ringing silence of a trap that is already snapped shut, its teeth hidden beneath velvet. She felt it in the way women curtsied to her with just a fraction less depth, in the way the courtiers spoke more softly when she entered a room, in the way eyes drifted not toward her crown, but toward Henry's expression, as if searching for a signal that the king himself could no longer disguise. Even the walls seemed to listen, and Anne, who had once walked through these corridors with the electric confidence of a woman who believed fate was written in her favor, now felt the cold breath of fate brushing against the back of her neck with each step she took. Henry, meanwhile, had already begun to move on, not openly, not with any declaration, but with a kind of listless detachment that filled the palace with unease. He rarely spoke her name, rarely entered her chambers, rarely allowed the softness of old affection to stray across his face. When he looked at Anne now, it was as though he were looking past her, past the memories of their passion, past the years of upheaval, past the child they had created, and into a place where she no longer existed. It was the kind of look that made even the boldest counselor uneasy, because they had seen that look before on the eve of Catherine's fall, when Henry had already decided she was no longer useful to the story he wanted to write about himself. For a long time, Anne tried to deny the shift. She told herself Henry was simply stressed, simply burdened, simply overwhelmed by the weight of the throne and the expectations crushing him. But the truth crept in slowly, threading its way into her awareness until it sat heavy in her chest. Henry was not moving away from her by accident. He was preparing to move without her entirely. At the edges of this unraveling, Thomas Cromwell watched with the patience of a man who understood that power rarely falls from a throne. It drips. Cromwell, once Anne's ally, had come to see her as an obstacle, especially after she challenged him publicly, accusing him of betraying Henry's interest and undermining the church reforms that had once united them. Their quarrel was brief, but in the world of kings and ministers, a brief quarrel could seed a lifetime of danger. Cromwell had built his rise on the precision of knowing when to strike and when to step aside. Now, sensing that the king was tiring of Anne and drifting toward Jane Seymour, he understood that Anne's fall was not only inevitable, it could be engineered. He began to collect whispers the way spiders collect the first vibrations of a fly on their web. Each rumor, whether born from truth or invented in a jealous mind, became a thread Cromwell tucked away for later use. Anne was too flirtatious. Anne laughed too freely. Anne danced with the wrong men. Anne had a quick temper. Anne had enemies in every corner of the court. The court musicians, Mark Smeaton and others, lingered too long in her presence. Servants noticed her eyes lingering with too much warmth on certain courtiers. Whether she had ever acted on these accusations did not matter. Cromwell only needed the suggestion, the shape, the silhouette of scandal lying in the dark. Henry himself had once used the same tactic to destroy Catherine, no outright proof, no undeniable evidence, just a shifting of perception until truth bent beneath the weight of intention. Anne began to sense that something was moving beneath her feet. It was in the way Cromwell bowed to her, too perfectly, too politely, as though he were sealing her fate with every gentle gesture. It was in the way ambassadors wrote home describing Anne as nervous or volatile, using words that could become weapons later. It was in the way Henry began to regard Jane Seymour, offering her small smiles that were barely there, small glances that softened only when he forgot Anne was watching. Jane's silence became its own kind of language. She never pressed, never demanded, never even truly engaged. Yet Henry felt steadied by her in ways that Anne's brilliance could no longer provide. The day rumors began to circle in earnest was a rainy morning in the spring of the year 1536. Anne stood near a window, watching the droplets race down the glass, when she overheard two ladies whispering in the corridor, not loudly, but carelessly enough that she knew the words were meant to reach her. They spoke of impropriety, of improvised dances, of locked doors and late-night laughter. They spoke of her name linked with the names of courtiers she had barely spoken to, and when they paused, glancing over their shoulders to see if anyone had heard, Anne realized that the trap was beginning to tighten faster than she had anticipated. Henry grew coldest after a sudden miscarriage that spring, a loss so painful it seemed to tear something loose inside her. She was weak, trembling, grieving when she reached out for Henry's hand, seeking comfort, seeking reassurance that their bond could still be repaired. But Henry pulled away with the quiet firmness of a man who had already decided his heart was no longer hers to hold. In the days that followed, the court whispered that Anne had lost the child because of stress, or because of fear, or because she was cursed, or because God had turned against her. Henry, in private, said nothing to contradict them. It was this silence that haunted her most. Henry did not rage. He did not accuse. He simply drifted farther and farther away until Anne felt as though she were speaking to a memory of the man she had married rather than the man himself. And Cromwell, sensing Henry's growing detachment, began to move swiftly. He gathered statements, coaxed confessions from frightened servants, twisted harmless interactions into treasonous implications, and constructed a narrative so damning that by the time Henry finally heard the accusations, he accepted them with frightening ease. It is easier to condemn a woman you already want to leave than one you cannot bear to lose. One evening, Henry rode out for a hunt and did not invite Anne. That was the moment she realized, with a sudden chill, that she was no longer queen in anything but name. She stood on the balcony watching him disappear into the trees, and the quiet that followed felt like the pause after a drum beat, the stillness before a sword swings downward. She felt dread settle across her shoulders like a cloak, heavy and suffocating, and she whispered into the empty air, as if saying it aloud could undo the reality forming around her. They mean to destroy me. She was right, and the machinery for her destruction was already turning. The machinery for Anne's destruction began moving so quietly that, for a moment, it seemed almost gentle, as though fate were offering her a brief mercy before tightening the rope. But mercy was never part of what followed. The first sign arrived not with shouts or soldiers, but with the sickly sweetness of courtly politeness and invitation to attend Henry at Greenwich for May Day celebrations. Anne felt a tremor beneath the velvet words of the summons, but she obeyed, dressing carefully, arranging her dark hair with trembling fingers, knowing that the court was watching her every gesture, every breath, every blink. She entered the festivities like a ghost stitched into a queen's body, walking with a grace so carefully preserved it seemed almost brittle, as though one misplaced movement might shatter her entirely. Henry sat in the royal box, expression unreadable, body bulky and stiff, eyes fixed on the jousting field as if he were searching for absolution in the pattern of splintering lances. Anne took her seat beside him, every muscle tense, her heart pounding against the cage of her ribs. She tried to speak, to soften the air between them, but Henry's replies were thin, clipped, tossed at her like crumbs rather than conversation. She felt the distance between them widening with each breath he took, until it seemed possible that the gulf between their chairs contained the entire kingdom. Mark Smeaton rode that day with unusual intensity, his lance striking with a desperate precision that made some of the spectators exchange uneasy glances. Those who knew the rumors whispered that he fought for more than glory, that he rode with the knowledge of accusations hanging over him like a blade suspended by a single thread. When his horse stumbled during a pass and Mark tumbled to the ground, Anne gasped involuntarily, her hand lifting toward her throat. It was a small gesture, instinctive, human, yet Henry saw it, and in his eyes, something dark shifted, something that had been waiting, coiling, preparing to strike. He stood abruptly, leaving the festivities without a word. The crowd murmured in confusion. Anne remained seated, frozen, watching Henry's red cloak vanish through the archway like the disappearing stroke of a sentence that had been left incomplete. She felt the sound around her fade into a distant hum, the shouts of the jousters blurring into a faraway echo. When she finally returned to her chambers, she found the guards already waiting outside her door. Their presence was not aggressive. It was worse, it was polite, quiet, final. That night, Anne barely slept. She knelt by her bed, whispering prayers that trembled into the cold air, tasting fear and iron and the bitter tang of unwanted memory. Elizabeth slept peacefully in her cradle, unaware that her mother's breathing grew more uneven with each passing hour. Anne touched the child's soft cheek, whispering promises she no longer believed she could keep. In the hallway outside, shadows moved with deliberate purpose. The Tower of London, ancient and patient, seemed to lean closer. Morning came without warmth. The knock at her door was soft, almost respectful. Yet the moment it sounded, Anne felt the world collapse inward. Sir William Kingston, Constable of the Tower, entered with a heavy solemnity that filled the room like a cold tide. His voice, though gentle, carried the weight of Henry's will. He informed her she was summoned to answer charges of adultery, treason, and incest. Charges so monstrous they did not need truth to make them effective. Charges designed not to accuse, but to condemn. Anne tried to stand, but her legs trembled violently. For a moment she thought she might faint, but she steadied herself by gripping the edge of the table, her fingers digging into the wood. She demanded to know who had accused her. Kingston lowered his gaze. She demanded to see Henry. Kingston shook his head. She demanded to see her daughter. Kingston hesitated, then said quietly that it was not possible. It was then Anne realized that everything had already been decided. Her guilt, her sentence, her future, none of it rested in her hands anymore. They led her to the waiting barge, the same type of vessel that had carried queens to coronations and traitors to execution. The Thames was gray that morning, swollen and silent, its surface trembling with the faint ripples of oar strokes. Anne sat rigid, staring into the water as though she hoped it might reflect a different life back at her, one where Henry still loved her, where their child was celebrated, where her future had not been traded for the pale comfort of a quiet, obedient face like Jane Seymour's. The tower rose ahead of her, its walls tall and weathered, its presence cold and absolute. As the barge slid beneath Traitor's Gate, Anne felt the chill seep into her bones. Generations had entered through that archway, but only a rare few had left. The water beneath her seemed to thicken, almost as though the river itself recognized her and mourned. When she stepped onto the stone landing, the air above seemed to vibrate with an ancient, echoing dread. The tower does not care why you arrive. It cares only that you do. Inside. Kingston guided her through the narrow corridors toward the royal apartments, ironically the same rooms Henry had ordered restored for her coronation. Now those rooms were her prison. Anne tried to preserve her dignity, tried to keep her steps steady, but her mind churned with terror. She saw Cromwell's cold smile in every flickering torch, felt Henry's growing hatred in every gust of damp wind that seeped through the stone walls. She knew Henry believed the lies because believing them was easier than admitting his grand act of rebellion had led to ruin. Anne had become the embodiment of his mistakes, and men do not forgive the mirrors that show them their own faults. That night, in her dim cell, Anne's composure cracked. She wept, silently at first, then uncontrollably, her sobs echoing off the stone until they sounded like someone else's cries, someone already halfway to death. When exhaustion finally pulled her down onto the thin mattress, she dreamed of her coronation, of the golden canopy held above her head, of Henry's proud smile, of the crowds cheering her name. But when she reached out to touch that memory, it dissolved into smoke, replaced by the cold touch of iron chains. Outside her window, ravens perched on the battlements, their black feathers rustling in the damp wind. They watched her room with an uncanny stillness, as though waiting. They were patient. The tower was patient. History itself was patient. The trial had not yet begun, but Anne Boleyn already understood the truth. She was never meant to leave this place alive. The tower did not rush its cruelty. It never has. Across all the centuries, it has stood watching the Thames slide past like a slow vein of silver. It prefers to work with time, letting dread settle into its prisoners like damp seeping into bone. For Anne, the first nights passed not in terror, but in something worse, a kind of trembling anticipation, as if every breath she took was borrowed from a future the tower intended to shorten. She waited for news, for word from Henry, for any sign that her husband still remembered the woman he had once sworn he could not live without. But the silence that wrapped itself around her chambers was complete, heavy, and deliberate. Henry was not coming, and Cromwell ensured she understood that. Interrogations began almost without being announced, slipping into her days like a cold draft through the cracks of her door. Gentle knocks, polite bows, men entering the room with quills tucked behind their ears, and expressions too calm to be anything but weaponized. They asked questions with smiling lips and calculating eyes, building a narrative piece by piece, threading her words into meanings she never intended. Every answer she gave honest, frightened, trembling seemed to open another door for suspicion. They asked about her musicians, her brother, her friends, about dances she barely remembered and jokes she had long forgotten. They twisted laughter into flirtation, kindness into conspiracy, and friendship into treason. And when she denied everything, they wrote anyway. Outside, Cromwell moved with the composure of a man conducting a symphony only he could hear. He summoned witnesses, coaxed confessions, crafted stories with precision. Mark Smeaton, cornered and terrified, broke first. He confessed under pressure to acts he likely never committed, his words quivering on parchment that would soon become the cornerstone of Anne's downfall. Others followed, some manipulated, some coaxed, some simply unlucky enough to have stood near Anne at the wrong moment. The web grew thicker, and every thread connected back to Anne, as though fate itself were conspiring to make her the architect of her own destruction. Meanwhile, Anne waited in her chambers with a stillness that felt unnatural for someone who had once filled courtrooms with her fire. She prayed often, not for her life, but for clarity, for strength, for Henry to remember the promise he once carved into the world with his decisions. She touched the stone walls as if they might give way to reveal a hidden passage leading her back to Elizabeth, back to sunlight, back to a time when her laughter echoed across the palace instead of disappearing into the damp corners of a prison. But the tower gave nothing. No softness, no cracks, only echoes. When the charges were finally brought to her in full detail, Anne's shock was so profound it didn't register at first as emotion. It was a moment of stillness, a moment where meaning failed. Adultery, treason, incest. Words so monstrous that even the men who said them seemed to shrink under their weight. Anne stared at them with eyes swollen from sleepless nights, as if expecting the accusations to evaporate into the air when spoken aloud. But they remained heavy, deformed, real. The trial was designed to be a spectacle, not a search for truth. Even before she was led into the hall, even before the lords assembled, even before the judges took their seats, her fate had already been stamped into the stone beneath her feet. Still, she entered with a grace that startled the room, her back straight, her chin lifted, her dark eyes clear despite the shadows beneath them. The courtiers watched, stunned, because for a moment, Anne looked like the same woman who had once dazzled the court with her voice, her wit, her intelligence. But this time there was something else in her expression, an acceptance that she could not win, and a dignity that refused to let her be broken before she fell. She listened to the accusations read aloud, her eyes moving over each accuser as though she were memorizing their faces for the quiet place inside her where memory transforms into judgment. The men speaking seemed almost embarrassed by their own words, some avoiding her gaze, others forcing themselves to meet it, as if afraid that her composure might reveal them as liars. When Anne was given a chance to speak, she did not cry, she did not rage. She spoke softly, calmly, with a clarity that startled even those who had long despised her. She denied every charge, offered explanations, appealed not to mercy but to reason, to fairness, to the truth she carried in her bones. But reason had no place in that chamber, mercy even less. The verdict was not born from what was said in the room, but from what Henry wanted outside it. Guilty. The word fell like a stone into an already deep well, sending ripples of finality through the crowded chamber. Some lords lowered their eyes, some looked relieved, others looked ashamed, but Anne simply stood there, very still, as though trying to absorb every ounce of the moment so history would not forget what had been done to her. She nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging that this was always how the story would end, once Henry's heart cooled and Cromwell's ambitions sharpened. In the days that followed, Anne prepared herself for the end, with a quiet that unnerved the guards. She prayed. She wrote letters. She spoke gently to the women assigned to watch her, comforting them when they cried for her fate. She asked Kingston about Elizabeth, but each time he could give her only vague assurances that the child was safe. That was not enough. Nothing was enough. The ache of being torn from her daughter pressed into Anne's lungs until it hurt to breathe. On the night before her execution was scheduled, Anne slept little. The tower was silent, its ancient stones holding their breath. She pressed her hands together and closed her eyes, whispering prayers not for rescue but for strength, because she understood now that courage at the end might be the only legacy she could leave to her daughter. When the dawn arrived, pale and cold, she felt strangely light, as though fear had burned through her in the night, leaving behind only the clarity of inevitability. The scaffold had already been built, and the tower, patient as ever, waited for her footsteps. The morning of Anne's execution unfolded with a stillness so absolute that even the ravens on the tower battlements seemed to pause their restless hopping, as though nature itself sensed the weight of what was about to occur. A thin mist clung to the stones, softening their harsh outlines, muffling footsteps, turning the world into a dim watercolor that felt strangely unreal, as if history were hesitating for a moment before committing this scene to memory. Inside her chamber, Anne rose early, her movements gentle, unhurried, almost ritualistic. She asked for the dark gown she had chosen the night before, its fabric carrying the quiet dignity she refused to abandon, and she arranged her hair with steady fingers, pulling it away from her neck with a care that made the women around her weep. She comforted them, not with false promises, but with a calmness that made her seem untethered from fear, as though she had crossed some invisible threshold during the long night and stepped into a place beyond terror. When Kingston entered, he found her standing by the window, looking out at the soft gray light as if studying her last morning in England. She turned toward him with a small, sad smile, and for a moment he looked almost ashamed to be the one responsible for escorting her to the scaffold. She thanked him for his kindness during her imprisonment, her voice warm, composed, heartbreakingly alive. Kingston bowed deeply, unable to speak, then offered his arm. Anne accepted, and together they began the long walk through the tower's narrow corridors, her steps light, nearly floating, the sound of her slippers brushing the stone echoing faintly like a memory unraveling. As she approached the courtyard, she heard the murmurs of the gathered crowd, courtiers, guards, servants, and a scattering of Londoners who had managed to gather despite the king's attempt to keep the execution private. The French executioner Henry had ordered, famed for his precision and speed, stood waiting near the scaffold, his sword hidden beneath the cloak he wore to maintain tradition. Anne stepped into the open air, the mist brushing her cheeks like the cold touch of a farewell, and she lifted her chin to face the people one last time. The scaffold itself seemed almost delicate, built of pale timber, its edges softened by the fog. A small crowd turned their faces toward her, and Anne, observing them with a steady gaze, climbed the steps with a poise so controlled it silenced the whispers around her. She stood upon the platform, the wind tugging softly at her gown, and once more thanked the men who had treated her gently in her final days. Her voice carried clearly across the courtyard, calm and resolute, each syllable shaped with care. She declared her innocence not with defiance, but with grace, saying she wished no ill upon the king, praying God would preserve him, praying God would watch over Elizabeth, praying that all who heard her would judge her actions and her heart with fairness one day, if not today. While she spoke, a hush settled over the courtyard. Even her enemies seemed momentarily disarmed by the quiet dignity she radiated. She finished her final prayer, closed her eyes for a long breath, then opened them again and nodded to Kingston, signaling she was ready. The executioner stepped forward, bowing deeply before her, promising the strike would be swift. Anne thanked him too, a gesture that sent a shiver through the crowd, because only a woman who had made peace with death could offer gratitude to the man meant to kill her. She removed her cloak with careful movements, handed her prayer book to one of her ladies, and knelt upon the straw-strewn platform. Instead of placing her head on a block, she knelt upright, hands folded, body still as carved stone, for the French method required no wooden rest. The executioner stepped back, sword still hidden beneath his cloak, circling around her silently, waiting for the moment when the tension in her shoulders softened into acceptance. Anne whispered her final prayer, her voice barely audible above the sound of the wind. Then the executioner performed the gesture for which he was known. He asked a guard for his sword, causing Anne to instinctively turn her head, searching for the sound. In that fractional instant, the real blade flashed from behind him, slicing through the mist with a whisper too sharp to be heard. The sword fell, and Anne Boleyn's life ended without a scream, without a cry, without a final tremor, so swiftly that even the ravens seemed startled into silence. Her head, small and delicate, lay upon the straw while her ladies collapsed around her, their sobs tearing through the courtyard with a rawness that made even the hardened guards look away. The executioner lifted the blade, glistening faintly in the muted light, and bowed again out of respect, though respect now meant nothing. The deed was done. As her body was carried away, the tower seemed to exhale, the air shifting with the heavy finality of a chapter closing. But beyond the stone walls, in every village and every whispered conversation, England trembled with unease. They had witnessed the fall of a woman who had once set the kingdom on fire with her intelligence and ambition. A woman crowned under a golden canopy, now reduced to a name spoken in sorrow, fear, admiration, or contempt depending on who held the memory. Henry received the news of her death with a coldness that chilled even his closest courtiers. They said he wore white the next day. They said he celebrated. They said he rode out in the sunlight as though freed from a burden. And within a mere handful of days, he became engaged to Jane Seymour, as if the tragedy of Anne Boleyn's fall had been nothing more than a brief, necessary correction to the story he was rewriting for himself. But history is not written by kings alone, and the shadow of Anne Boleyn would stretch far beyond that courtyard, far beyond Henry's satisfaction, far beyond the tower. For even as her body was laid to rest in the chapel nearby, the child she left behind, Elizabeth, was already carrying the quiet ember of a future that would one day burst into flame, turning her mother's name from scandal into legend, from disgrace into strength, from execution into immortality. And Henry, in the silent chambers of his life to come, in the nights that pressed too hard against his conscience, would find that Anne's ghost did not vanish on the scaffold. It merely stepped into the shadows and waited for him,